As a conservative, I believe in the principle of Chesterton's fence, which is G.K. Chesterton was a British thinker, and he always, cautioned that reformers would always be wanting to kind of tear down fences to serve their immediate purposes. But he said you never should tear something down without really having a good understanding of why it was put up in the first place, because that fence might be doing something that, or keeping something in or out that you would quickly lose sight of.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James Christian Blockwood. Today, we have two distinguished guests, Xavier de Souza Briggs, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Daniel Stid, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. They will share their insights on the evolving role of philanthropy in shaping society and what may be next for democratic institutions in this uncertain environment. As we all know, philanthropy and foundations play a major role in shaping society. Can you tell us more about what you think that role should be? Let's start with you, Zav.
Philanthropy has a long history promoting social innovation, giving life to things that are very new, that represent some form of public value or community value. Whether we think about Andrew Carnegie and the invention of community libraries as something that all people should have access to, not just the very affluent, or public broadcasting, or a number of other things, sort of demonstration workforce programs that then get scaled up by government or incorporated by the marketplace. Philanthropy's role as a seed funder of innovation has historically been very, very important. But philanthropy has played other roles too. One is promoting, for example, broad public awareness, either of problems that we need to think about or understand in new ways, of something going on in government that's not getting enough attention, at least in the minds of philanthropy, or in other ways, creating a public that is more ready to act on its challenges and its opportunities. And a final role I'll name, and this list is not exhaustive, of course, is a de-risker, a little bit of a jargony word, but an actor that has assets that are more flexible than almost any other actor out there, that doesn't face either voters or customers in the market in the usual business sense, that can deploy resources, for example, to reduce the risk on private capital coming into something, demonstrate what's possible in that process, and so bring into being things like new models of housing affordability, or investment in startup businesses in new fields, market building and market making, literally, in ways that the public, I think, is much less aware of than some of those other roles.
And Daniel, what do you think?
Well, first off, I want to, as they say in Congress, associate myself with Zav's remarks here. I think they were very on point. In particular, I appreciate him noting how a lot of the civic infrastructure that we take for granted, for example, the Carnegie libraries. I was just in my hometown in Michigan recently, and there's a big Carnegie library there that kind of echo on through generations. So you sort of lose sight of what gave rise to them. But if you look at many of the great institutions that mark our liberal democracy, they had their origins in philanthropy. From my perspective, I would just add a couple of things. One is looking at philanthropy as a critical institution within civil society, as distinct from the government and political sphere, and as distinct from the market. And I think one of the primary roles of philanthropy is supporting an ample and healthy and broadly representative pluralism within civil society. By pluralism, I mean both, that articulates the perspectives and viewpoints of a wide range of different religious and regional and ideological and racial and other types of groupings. So pluralism is part of the diversity of the country, but also operates in ways that reflect the values we need to kind of keep that pluralism of our liberal democracy that was kind of baked into the republic from the start and has become more fully realized over time. The other thing I would point out is we often think of philanthropy as being what, the Hewlett Foundation where I work, the Ford Foundation where Zav worked, or the Gates Foundation, these big institutional funders. But there are also many other forms of philanthropy, some of which are much more place-based and democratic in their orientation. When I say democratic, more what we might call in the business everyday givers, people giving a small amount to causes or organizations that they care about, especially especially in their communities. And I think that everyday giving really contributes to the pluralism of American philanthropy. And so I wouldn't want us to lose sight of that also.
There's two more things to sort of put a fine point on, I think, that are more controversial than some of philanthropy's other roles vis-a-vis government and the public. So one is perhaps the most traditional of all, and that is acting in a charitable mode. And I mention that in connection to controversy, and in part to make a little good trouble here, as the late Congressman Lewis would call it. When philanthropy is acting on social needs directly, there is the important question, is it substituting for what government should do? Or put another way, what we, the people acting through our government and directing it on our behalf, should handle, whether it's homelessness, food pantries, community resilience after a storm, any of those things. And I mention this in part because there's a very long and strong and large tradition of private charity in America. And this is probably how most people think about the role of philanthropy. But for Europeans and for others, it raises these huge questions. Why do the Americans rely so much on private giving rather than telling their government to meet more of these needs? So that's an important debate. And the other one is policy advocacy. To me, it is certainly a part of, as Daniel said, philanthropy acting as a part of a vibrant, vast civil society. But I mention it and suggest that it is not without controversy because philanthropy has at times been accused in this mode of being third-party government, of being unelected, putting its thumb on the scale, trying to influence what the public thinks. And I'm referring to a C3, nonpartisan, non-electoral form of influence. But all of the philanthropies that Daniel named and many others as well have supported voter engagement on issues, have supported policy advocacy. It has led to remarkable things, but it does leave the public and sometimes the media wondering, hey, is philanthropy outrunning its remit, so to speak, especially given its nonprofit status? Should it be so actively trying to influence where policymakers land or public managers land on a given set of issues?
Well, Zav, let's dig into that a bit. I mean, you've made a very good argument in the role that philanthropy plays, particularly in communities and shaping policy. Some could argue, though, that most foundations or individual philanthropists, especially in the democracy building space, are more progressive and that they have a more progressive agenda. Do you agree? And if so, do you think there's space for foundations to constructively engage the current administration or to do things in a way that they potentially wouldn't typically address them?
Well, there's a spectrum of philanthropic giving in this area, like many others. And some of it, I would say, focuses very much on what we might think of as the basic civics of a healthy democracy, literally many things that we learn in school. And that is access to the ballot box, a free and clear ability to vote, not just a right that's codified, but the actual access to voting, which has been so hard fought, as we all know, over the history of our country. Things like journalism being able to play a really important role in informing the public and recognizing that journalism has changed a lot. And the coming of the big internet search giants, for example, Google and social media as well, Facebook and much more, have radically changed news media, access to information. So have other things in the marketplace and in the way we consume information. So philanthropy acting on these things, at least in some respects, in some spectrum of approaches, is in principle trying to shore up for a modern society the basic workings, the checks and balances, as I said, access to voting, people's ability to gather together between elections and make their voices heard, these kinds of things, not so much a left or right or any other ideological influence, but the creation, if you will, of enabling conditions on a relatively level playing field, again, at least in principle, for the public and for interest groups in conversation with policymakers to hash out what public policy should be. That said, we are in a digital age. We're in a very polarized and partisan age before we even get to the current federal administration, the Trump presidency, and what the administration is seeking to do. In some instances, some of these basic civics, if you will, are argued over as though they were very partisan issues or have become, is another way of saying it, more partisan, I think, than many of us wish they would be, including rules around voting, voting ID, executive power, and how extensive it should be, and efforts that Daniel was certainly a part of, really important efforts by the Hewlett Foundation, for example, to help Congress become a stronger, more functional, more modern institution, a fascinating set of efforts there and a nonpartisan set. But all of these can be looked at, if we so choose, as a stealth agenda, if you will, as favoring one party's platform over another, when in fact much of it seeks to strengthen the rules and the institutions themselves, not necessarily to favor a particular policy outcome.
Daniel, let's actually get into perhaps what the current administration is doing. In a recent op-ed, you wrote about the Trump administration's efforts to freeze federal funding for nonprofit contractors and grantees, and essentially talked about how that's disrupting different parts of civil society. In this piece, you ask a really good question: why the sudden switch to non-governmental? Can you maybe tell us more about what was behind that question and your thoughts on the answer?
Sure. I just was intrigued. There was an executive order that the president, a 2-paragraph, 4-sentences executive order that President Trump issued, or actually it was a memorandum to the heads of agencies and departments, basically saying the government's funding a lot of non-governmental organizations. I believe a lot of them are working against the interest of the United States. I'm asking all of my heads of departments to review their funding for non-governmental organizations and only fund those that are consistent with my administration's policies. I think that is and I think that reflects and is being used to accelerate a set of really profound policy shifts in the administration of domestic policy that are no less sweeping than I think we've seen in the shift in foreign policy between the kind of global internationalism that has largely been a consensus probably going back to World War II. So in foreign and national security policy, we've seen the administration bring in some fundamental sea changes. And I think the further it goes down this road, we'll see a very similar thing in domestic policy changes that go back in particular to the Great Society period of Lyndon Johnson. And that is that the government at all levels, but in particular the federal government, and insofar as it's supporting local, state and local government, really outsources the implementation of a broad array of policies through grants and contracts to nonprofits. And those can be nonprofits that are delivering and administering human and social and health services. They can be nonprofits like Harvard University that are undertaking scientific research supported by the National Institutes of Health or the Center for Disease Control, that there has been really a hybrid form of government in which government funding supports the work of a broad swath of nonprofits and civil society. And that has been something that has been broadly accepted by administrations of both parties. There's, at the margins, from Democratic to Republican administrations, you'll see some shifts in emphasis, but both at home and abroad with respect to scientific research, with respect to education, with respect to youth development, with respect to global development and the promotion of democracy, there's been a broad consensus on the need for government to work with and through, and the federal government to work with and through nonprofit organizations in implementing policy. I'll note that right from the outset, there were some people both on the left and the right and in the center that have expressed reservations about this and about the extent to which could be reducing these civic associations, these nonprofits, to more appendages or vendors of the government and thus under its control, in the same way that, profit-seeking government consultants are rightly under the control of the government that is letting contracts with them. From a public administration standpoint, which I know will be of interest to your audience, people like John DiIulio, who've written very, I think, cogently about the challenges of public administration when you are delegating the implementation of policy to third parties outside of the control of government. In writing that piece, and it's the first of a series and ultimately of a book I'm planning to write, what I was trying to do is say, why is the administration using the phrase non-governmental as opposed to the more traditional nonprofit? And I think partly it is because the administration, I think in particular, Russell Vought at OMB and others in the administration, that are looking wherever they can to reduce federal spending and investment of programs that they don't endorse, and I'll put it in neutral terms like that, don't support, are looking for ways to cut back. And I think one of the ways that rhetorically they can say, if these are ostensibly non-governmental organizations, why is the government funding them in the first place? And the answer, I kind of put the cart before the horse here, is going back to what I was saying earlier, because for several decades now, the government has relied on these kind of partnership with a whole host of nonprofits to implement the policy. So there is an answer, and it's also an answer, I should note, that is embodied in laws that Congress has made and appropriations that Congress has extended. So I think one of the boldest aspects of the current administration's disruption of civil society is that it is reserving to the executive branch a much more profound control of federal expenditures than has to date been presumed or recognized by people in Congress or the executive or the courts. And I think whether, the extent to which it will be able to maintain that control is something that I think will play out over the next 2 or 3 years.
Zav, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well, and what you think ultimately will be the impact. You've also, though, worked as a former faculty member at Harvard and MIT and NYU. Universities are experiencing dramatic disruption to their fundings and operations right now as well. So can you talk about that from the both non-governmental perspective, nonprofit, but also how that impacts academia?
Sure. In addition to the roles you named, I've also served in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. And these questions are sort of your daily bread. At the most basic level, you're asking, what should the federal government do or not do at all? Sort of what areas should it enter or not enter at all? And in those areas where it ought to have a role, ought to play a role, what should that look like? How extensive should it be? What sorts of costs or reasonable, or let me put it in an OMB sort of way, what is the most cost-effective way to accomplish some important result? Not just how do we make the numbers add up, but what is the best way for the federal government if it is spending on something to accomplish a result that the public actually cares about? And then you get, it seems to me, into all kinds of things. If the answer is yes, there should be involvement and it takes on a particular character, then we get into all these sorts of questions. What conditions, for example, should be attached to funding? What exactly is the relationship? It's already implied in the way Daniel laid it out. There's the non-governmental sphere, including much of higher ed, as a part of civil society, as a part of our associational life, if you will, the realm of ideas and connections among citizens and deliberating issues and voice, and also of research, right? To shed light on public problems and engage with the public around them. I'm invoking John Dewey a little bit here as I say that. Democracy requires a public that can act as a public, not just a state, the machinery of government. But then there's the other role, a lot of it non-governmental or for-profit in some cases, and that is organizations acting as contractors in one way or another, as performing in exchange for the receipt of public monies. Daniel mentioned the important R&D function. There's human services, there's health, there are all these different areas, and they are vast. Coming to the universities now, since this has been so in the spotlight, in recent months in particular, I can say that on one hand, there is an incredibly important, in many ways, symbiotic, or maybe the better word is interdependent relationship between higher ed and the federal government. It's clearest in areas perhaps as R&D. You're clear in that function. The amounts of money are extremely significant when it comes to the resource base for research universities, especially. Harvard has been much in the news, Columbia, others, but there are many more, of course. And as Daniel said, since the Second World War, there has been an evolving understanding, but a very large-scale commitment by our nation's government to invest in leading research. It's research that corporations, for the most part, will not do because it's too high risk, it's early stage. But the fruits of that research matter for the markets, for our economy in so many different ways, and therefore for us as the public. And there's a set of conversations there. What's a reasonable overhead, for a university to charge the government? What topics are most important? What does the frontier look like, or what should it look like? Whether it's in medical research, materials, national security in many different dimensions, communications, of course, surveillance. And all this has raised important questions for the public, too, about privacy and much, much more. But beyond the R&D, there's also instruction or human capital building, skilling, preparing a citizenry, ideally that's prepared to function as an informed public and engage in civil debate, which has become hard for us, frankly, as a people for many reasons. and preparing us as workers to perform in the economy. Just seen a huge expansion of higher ed, especially since the Second World War and the GI Bill and the actions of the 60s, the creation of Pell Grants and student loans and so much more. And we're now very much in a debate with a wrenching set of proposals, if you're in higher ed, proposed by the Trump administration, and unknowns about where exactly Congress will land on this when it comes to appropriations and authorization for higher ed. And if you're in a university, speaking as an ex-professor for the moment, you're concerned about autonomy, the autonomy of the learning process, the terms of federal funding. You're concerned in many instances, thinking of my current and former colleagues, about the affordability of higher education. You're very conscious of its high costs and the concern of working families and others about whether college is a good deal, to put it simply, and whether it should change dramatically. And if so, how? There's a whole spectrum of concerns that touch on or connect to, but sort of go beyond the headlines of the moment, if I'm making sense.
You've done a great job highlighting some of the attempts of the Trump administration to kind of reshape how higher ed is looked at in this regard. But that's not the only place that they're doing that. They're also rethinking government institutions and how that should function and how that should serve the people. Daniel, you've been working in this space for quite some time, and philanthropy has long played a role in helping to support government institutions, in particular administrative reform of those institutions. What are your thoughts on how the administration is trying to shape some of that and what the role philanthropy should be playing right now?
I actually think this is a period of tremendous ferment in how we think about the functioning of government institutions and public administration. I mean, as your listeners will know, there's been a number of important books written recently about how to reform government. I'm thinking in particular of Jen Paulka's Recoding America. Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have recently come out with Abundance. And so I think there is a burgeoning school of thought that really kind of spans the ideological and political spectrum. The most visible dimension of the administration's approach to, public service reform has clearly been Elon Musk and Doge. I think in retrospect, my prediction will be we will see that as a bright, shiny object, a kind of a flash in the pan, although one that I think as a flash will create a lot of lasting problems in public administration because of the haphazard and uninformed way in which it is unfolded. And paradoxically, it might make it harder just by the disruptions that it has foisted on institutions in ways that haven't really been thought through in terms of their second and third and fourth order implications. Might make it harder to actually come along and do the kind of fundamental rethinking of government for the digital age. I think actually the more important legacy of the Trump administration on our governing institutions, if it succeeds, has been the administration's assertion of a wide range of decisions around government spending and the direction of government spending and the amount and levels of government spending that in our system of separated powers are really meant to reside with Congress. And insofar as it's able to disrupt the flow of appropriated funds and do so in a way that is even approximates its ambitions, I think that will really shift the balance of how our government works. And it's not clear to me that it will happen for the better. I mean, the last thing I'll say in this point is someone said, well, isn't what Elon Musk and Doge are doing is really stripping government down to the studs so that you can rebuild something in its place. And I think that presumes a planfulness and an appreciation for these institutions that has been entirely lacking. And so I think what you're saying is more kind of a wrecking ball that's leaving some studs with the walls completely attached and in place and others, broken off halfway. As a conservative, I believe in the principle of Chesterton's fence, which is G.K. Chesterton was a British thinker, and he always, cautioned that reformers would always be wanting to kind of tear down fences to serve their immediate purposes. But he said you never should tear something down without really having a good understanding of why it was put up in the first place, because that fence might be doing something that or keeping something in or out that you would quickly lose sight of. And I think that is really unfortunately, the thing that's occurring right and left is all sorts of fences are being torn down without an appreciation for the functions that they serve or how those functions might be replicated in a better or more economic or more effective way.
Zav, you've been working at the forefront of advancing communities at the local level for a number of years. What advice might you have for organizational leaders or other leaders at the community level that may work with government or may have in the past received some level of federal grant or benefit that may be experiencing things very differently right now amidst all this change?
Well, this is a very, very difficult challenge. On one hand, just to extend or to build on Daniel's thinking, there is a very, very clear sense in which we should not let this crisis go to waste. In my judgment, it is a crisis in a number of different dimensions. There's the legal and constitutional. There's also the funding and the fiscal, now amplified by the risk of recession, of fallout of a trade war. Again, without going into all the whys and wherefores, let alone pretending to have a crystal ball. There are all those macro forces, if you're working at the state or local level, as you said, James, or in tribal government, let's say. Tribes are in a very specific relationship to the U.S. government and struggle with a lot of challenges as well in tribal communities. There is an emerging set of ideas about how to deal with this moment when you're at the local level. So you're not necessarily engaged directly in the conversation that Daniel pointed to about those federal functions, why certain features of our federal government have existed at all and how they've evolved. And whether, Daniel, I'm just going to extend the metaphor you used a tiny bit, this metaphor of the fences or whatnot. Why do they exist? What are those things doing? And do you have any thinking about a reasonable alternative? If the public values something and government is important to accomplishing it, and the federal government specifically, there's the issue of being able to replace something you've removed or weakened with something that's actually better, as opposed to leaving a gap. And at the local level, there is a very, very acute sense that there's this messy conversation going on with uncertain outcomes at the federal level, now playing out on a global stage as well, with headwinds facing the economy. And we at the local level are left to deal with the mess, frankly. These things affect transfers of monies, extremely important in some areas of what government does, whether it's the Medicaid cost match to states or infrastructure funding or rental housing assistance, the number one tool, as imperfect as it is, the number one tool for limiting homelessness in our country, for preventing it from being an even bigger problem. We have really good evaluation evidence on that over years and years. So local governments are accustomed to sort of dealing with a set of tools, as clunky as they can be to work with, especially when it comes to compliance requirements, reporting, and accessing that funding. But they've counted on a number of those for a very long time. And when they've changed, they don't tend to change abruptly. And here we are in a really different moment. And they're sort of saying, look, this is going to be phased, but there's an immediate term of responding, of understanding where your biggest risks are and how you may need to adapt, as though in a storm, that a moment of intense focus and near-term action to limit the damage. There's a recovery period. And then there's this issue of rebuilding, for example, of rethinking the models for funding and for accomplishing things. This is unfinished business and opportunities for reform and improvement. But that, I think, gives you some sense of how local leaders are thinking about something that is in many ways analogous to a big and very sudden storm.
Let's leave it there. Xavier de Souza Briggs is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is an award-winning educator and researcher. Daniel Stid is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His work focuses on civil society, philanthropy, and democratic governance. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.